Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to share this topic with you today, mainly because it's going to completely shift how you look at both history and our future. We're exploring the legendary macroeconomic investor Ray Dalio's framework for predicting the future, and we're doing it by looking backward. Over his 50-year career, Dalio realized something really profound. He noticed that the biggest surprises in the global economy only shocked him because, well, they just hadn't happened in his lifetime yet. But by zooming out and analyzing the last 500 years of history, he discovered a highly predictable life cycle of global empires. It's like a giant historical puzzle, and today, we're putting the pieces together.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The day money changed. 2. The big cycle explained. 3. Phase 1, the rise. 4. Phase 2, the peak. 5. Phase 3, the decline. And finally, 6. Navigating our future. Let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, the day money changed. To really understand where we're heading, we first need to take a quick trip back to a seriously shocking moment in 1971. At the time, Ray Dalio was just a young clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange when the unthinkable happened. The United States essentially ran out of money and defaulted on its debts.
Now, you'd probably assume a massive default would completely crash the economy, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The exact opposite happened. The stock market surged nearly 25%. Dalio dug into the history books and found the exact same thing happened back in 1933 under President Roosevelt. You see, when a country runs out of money and breaks its link to gold, it just prints more paper money. And all that new money flowing into the system artificially inflates the prices of assets like stocks, gold, and commodities.
President Nixon delivered this massive news to the world on a Sunday evening, but you better believe he didn't call it a default. Instead, he claimed he was taking action to, quote, defend the dollar against the speculators. It was just a brilliant piece of diplomatic spin. By temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold, he made it sound like a bold, strategic defense, rather than a confession that the nation's gold vaults were basically emptying out. To really grasp why this was such a game changer, we have to remember how money used to work. Historically, gold was the actual real money used to settle up between countries. Paper money, like the US dollar, was literally just an IOU. It was like a check in a checkbook. It only had value because you could, theoretically, go to the bank and swap it for actual gold. But by 1971, the US had written way more paper checks than it had gold in the bank to cover them. They broke that promise, and paper money as the world knew it was changed forever.
Which brings us to Section 2. The big cycle explained. That dramatic shock in 1971 wasn't just some unprecedented anomaly. When Dalio looked back, he found that this exact cycle of debt, money printing, and shifting global power is part of a highly predictable historical pattern. So let's zoom out and look at the macro view of this big cycle.
Before we go any further, we need to define two crucial concepts that drive the mechanics of global dominance. First, a world order. This is simply the governing system for how people and countries deal with each other, and it's usually established by treaties after a major global conflict. Second, a reserve currency. Think of this as a currency that is widely accepted all around the world as a medium of exchange and a safe place to store wealth. Having the world's reserve currency, that is literally the ultimate superpower for an empire.
When we map this entire concept out over the last 500 years, we see these overlapping life cycles that last roughly 250 years each. Notice the sequential dominance happening here. The Dutch Empire rose with the guilder in the 1600s, followed by the British Empire and the pound in the 1800s, and then the US Empire and the dollar in the 1900s. And in our present day, we're seeing the rising Chinese Empire and the yuan. It's also worth noting that the transitions between these empires aren't usually smooth. They typically involve 10 to 20 years of pretty intense conflict.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how Dalio measures the objective health of these empires. He uses these 8 specific vital signs of power. Just like a doctor checks your blood pressure and heart rate, we can objectively measure a nation's education, its technological inventiveness, its share of world trade, its military strength, and ultimately its reserve currency status. Watching these specific indicators rise and fall tells us exactly what stage of the life cycle an empire is currently experiencing.
Now let's explore Section 3, Phase 1, the rise. Let's break down the anatomy of this cycle, starting with this very first phase. The rise usually kicks off right after a major conflict establishes a brand new world order, ushering in a long period of peace and prosperity.
During this initial rise, successful revolutionary leaders generally follow 4 distinct steps. First, they win power by gaining more support than the opposition. Second, they consolidate that power by weakening or eliminating their rivals.
Third, they establish new institutions and systems that make the country work smoothly and efficiently. And fourth, and this one is absolutely crucial for an empire's longevity, they pick great successors, or they build reliable systems that ensure great leaders follow them over several generations. These foundational steps build into what we call a virtuous cycle. It always starts with a strong foundation in education and character. That education leads directly to massive technological innovation. For example, back in the day, the Dutch became highly educated and literally invented the ships that could travel the globe, as well as the concept of capitalism to fund those very voyages. That kind of innovation drives massive global trade, which of course requires a strong military to protect it. All of this newfound wealth builds deep capital markets and ultimately earns the nation that coveted reserve currency status.
But here is where things get fascinating, and honestly, a bit tragic. We now enter Section 4, Phase 2, the peak. As we transition into this phase, we learn that the very fruits of an empire's success inevitably plant the seeds of its own downfall.
So, what happens as a country gets richer? Well, people get accustomed to the easy life. Values shift from the battle-hardened generations who actually earned the wealth to later generations who simply inherited it and tend to pursue luxuries and decadence. Meanwhile, people just assume the good times will keep rolling, so they borrow heavily, creating massive financial bubbles. Most notably, the financial gains from all this success come very unevenly. This opens up a severe gap between the wealthy haves and the poorer have-nots, which breeds deep, deep societal resentment.
On top of that, maintaining global dominance is wildly expensive. The leading empire has to protect its global interests everywhere. Eventually, the sheer cost of defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in. To put that into perspective, the U.S. has spent roughly $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences just since September 11th. To fund this unprofitable global overextension, rich empires ironically end up borrowing heavily from poorer nations that save more.
This massive financial overextension, combined with rising internal tension, brings us right to Section 5, Phase 3, the decline. This is the final, painful phase of the big cycle, where internal systems begin to break down entirely, leaving the empire incredibly vulnerable to external challengers.
When those massive debt bubbles finally burst and the economic pie starts shrinking, internal conflict just skyrockets. This drives intense political polarization. Historically, we typically see the rise of strong populist leaders from both sides. Left-wing populism emerges with a core goal to forcefully redistribute the wealth, while right-wing populism emerges to aggressively defend the wealth of those who already hold it. This extreme polarization severely weakens the country from the inside out.
Once that internal conflict really takes hold, the downward spiral accelerates fast. Debt bubbles burst, and the government is essentially forced into massive money printing, which heavily devalues the currency. The wealthy start to panic and move their money out of the country, a process called capital flight. Seeing all this internal chaos, external rival powers recognize the weakness and begin to test the dominant empire's military strength. This dangerous combination drastically raises the risk of civil or even global war.
But the definitive end of the cycle, the final nail in the coffin, is a total loss of faith in the empire's money. The true turning point arrives when the rest of the world stops saving in the empire's reserve currency and starts aggressively selling it off. We saw this exact thing happen with the run on the Bank of Amsterdam for the Dutch, and we saw it with the massive post-World War II debt crisis for the British. Once the world abandons the currency, that's it. The cycle is over.
So, what does this 500-year historical framework mean for us, right now, today? Let's move to Section 6, Navigating Our Future. Let's zoom back into our present day and diagnose our current standing so we can effectively chart a path forward. If we look closely at the current vital signs of the United States, we definitely see some late-stage symptoms. The U.S. is carrying massive debt, it's printing huge amounts of new money, and it's experiencing severe internal polarization and external conflicts. However, it is absolutely critical to note that it hasn't crossed the line into total decline just yet. The Great Wars haven't started, and most importantly, the massive global sell-off of the US dollar has not yet begun.
So the crucial point is this. Reversing a decline is incredibly difficult, but it is entirely possible if we pay close attention to our vital signs. Dahlia boils this entire massive framework down to a profoundly simple micro takeaway for surviving the changing world order. The ultimate survival metric comes down to just two things. We must earn more than we spend, and we must treat each other well. That's it. Every other metric, whether it's education, inventiveness, or military strength, is just a means of achieving those two foundational goals.
And that leaves us with an incredibly urgent personal reflection as we wrap up this explainer. Dalio's framework proves that our collective future depends entirely on our internal health. Can we earn more than we spend? And can we treat each other well? The clock is ticking on the big cycle. Which side of history will we choose to be on?